Join me, Natasha Smith, and my guests for an exclusive 6-episode series of the Can You Just Sit With Me podcast. Each episode is filled with hard yet needed conversations about loss, grief, and suffering. Come and sit with us for hope and healing for your journey. Listen on Apple Podcasts or wherever you stream. So, have you ever had a moment when you wanted to ask someone the question, can you just sit with me?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that's so common in our entire lives, but especially in times when we're going through something hard. In my case, it was chronic pain, that what I really needed was someone just to be physically present with me and know that I wasn't alone in the room or alone with my pain and anxiety and doubts and fears. So I think it's easy to want to fix people's problems,
Yeah.
and I got a lot of that in the times when I was going through a lot of faith questions and also physical issues. But sometimes what I needed the most was just someone to sit with me and say, you're not alone, and I'm with you.
Yeah. Chronic pain and illness is something that I like to place into this category of a living loss, because often when we think about grief, we associate it with the death of a loved one. Yet we can suffer many losses and different types of grief, and chronic pain and illness is one of those. So I'm grateful to have this opportunity to sit with Liuan Huska as she talks about the pain and suffering that she has experienced through chronic pain and illness. So keep listening. And that's so hard, and that's one of the things that like when we talk about grief and hurting and pain, we get those the people who are maybe well wishers or people who mean well, but it can it can do something to us, the griever, the one who's hurting, the one who's suffering. What are some of the things that um if you could just kind of share that some things that people have said that may not have been as helpful as it seemed to them, but it could have been more harmful to you.
hmm I think I always cringe when people say God has a plan.
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
I think it it I guess it makes me feel like God intended for me to suffer, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
That one's always a little tricky, even though I also want to believe that God is ultimately behind everything and everything will be okay in the end. I
Hmm.
think saying God has a plan makes it feel like everything has to go in some kind of step by step order and some kind
Yeah.
of formula for it to make
Yeah.
it work. And so it makes me feel sometimes that maybe I've fallen out of God's plan if things
Right.
don't
Yeah.
feel right. Don't feel like I'm not feeling God's presence or not hearing from God the way I used to hear from God, those kinds of things.
Hmm.
Sometimes people will say, everything has a purpose. That's
Yeah.
one that also is like, well, what if I can't figure out that purpose?
Right.
Um, and maybe there is. I guess it's just when people try to jump too quickly to the thing that makes you feel better
Right. Exactly.
instead of giving you the time and space to be in the pain and in the grief and the uncomfortable spots.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Those are some great examples, and certainly some that I've heard of myself. And like you said, you know, people, it's easy for them to want to help, like they want to help, but I think it's because of our culture who wants to jump to get well, be healed, there are feet to the pavement, keep running, right? um
Right.
and that's just, in reality, it's not how it works. We
Yeah,
do
for
have to
sure.
take that time, that space to sit. in some of the hard places. And so I
Mhm.
want you to kind of take us um, through your story a bit, and then we
Mhm.
can kind of chat through some of the things from your book as well.
Sure. Yeah. So, uh, well, I'm 35 now. So when I was 22 or so, I was right out of college and started having chronic ankle pain, and went to a lot of different doctors, got lot of different diagnoses, and tried a lot of different treatments, but the pain just kept going. And for me, as a young person, that was really frustrating because I really wanted to get back to my life. And
Yeah.
I felt like this was an interruption to my life. And I prayed for healing and asked people to pray for me, and uh, wasn't getting the kind of healing I was expecting.
Yeah.
And that really led to a faith crisis because I just assumed that if I had enough faith or did it the right way, prayed the right way, that God would heal me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that comes from a lot of teachings, some of them false within our churches, and also a lot of assumptions within our society of what healing means and what it means to have a good life, a purposeful life.
Yeah.
And so I was having a really hard time matching my reality with what I expected out of my life,
Mm-hmm.
and wasn't finding really satisfactory answers in the church. I really had enjoyed being in my body up to then. It's just a source of joy and connection for me. So to have part of my body that didn't work and was causing me pain was really challenging, and I was seeking answers for how how I could still be in pain but still experience Jesus as a healer, um, and how to still have meaning in my life. But a lot of times the answers I was getting, or the kind of responses people gave me, were to ignore my body, to say things like you're fine, you can still minister to people and you can still pray for people at night when you're waking up at night because you're in so much pain. And there's basically the message was you can just ignore your body because your body isn't really that important to your spiritual life. Like your spiritual life is all these other things that are separate from your body. And I felt intuitively that that wasn't true, but I couldn't find the words to kind of articulate that at the moment. So this
Yeah.
book was kind of a journey for me to begin to explore and articulate why it was important that I still stay connected with my body, and how our bodies are still a part of our spiritual lives, even when they're in pain and we're experiencing suffering in our bodies.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, your story. I love when you talk about your book and how you said in writing it, it was like exploring all these things and these questions that you had. And I feel like even, as I was writing my book, it's the same thing, similar. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
how can, sitting in so much grief and even, having those prayers of, Lord, I thought you was going to heal my sister or my dad, coming to almost, a crisis of faith and trying to
Mm-hmm.
reconcile, like almost like
Mm-hmm.
this gap in what I've been taught, what
Mm-hmm.
what I've seen, healings in other people, those type things, and then what reality
Mm-hmm.
is. It was trying to reconcile all those things. So it was so challenging, and sometimes it still is. But like as you were saying in writing your
Mm-hmm.
book, you were kind of discovering for you
Mm-hmm.
how to connect your body with spirit, which just in reading your words, they were challenging to me because I believe some of that same teaching that you mentioned in your
Mm-hmm.
book. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I've kind of walked a path of challenging some of those teachings from the past.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's talk about some of that because people may not be privy to have read your book yet, Hurting Yet
Mm-hmm.
Whole. And so let's kind of talk about, let's kind of dive into healing and
Sure.
our expectations of what healing is. So yeah, what does healing really look like? And then kind of
Mm-hmm.
what do we see in culture and maybe even taught in church that challenges when we actually are praying for healing for ourselves or we're going through, as you mentioned, you know, a chronic illness or chronic pain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack for
Ouch.
sure. Um, so when I thought about healing, when I first started praying for healing, I thought about it as like going back to normal. And then of course the word normal also has a lot of different
Yeah.
meanings. But I just assumed that God designed my body to work properly and to not have pain and not have disease and whatever like dysfunctions it was having. And so for me, I was praying that I would not be in
Yeah.
pain and I would just be healthy and be able to do all the things I wanted to do. And of course, that didn't happen. So I I either could assume that, well, then maybe I'm not doing it right, or maybe God doesn't want to heal me, or maybe God isn't the healer that He um, says He is in the Bible.
Yeah.
So those are all things that people start to question, right? When we pray for things and they don't turn out as we expect them to. And so then I started to kind of question, well, maybe some of the ideas I have about healing um, aren't aren't what God has in mind for
Yeah.
me, as much as I really wanted
Yeah.
to not be in
Yeah.
pain. And so I started to think a little bit more about what, going back to the story of creation, what it actually says about our bodies. And I found some really helpful, theology about um, kind of taking apart the idea that all of our illness and pain has to do with sin, and that is like part of the brokenness of our world.
Hmm.
And I know that's a really challenging idea because I
Yeah.
think that's very common to think that it all has to do with sin, even if it's not our own personal sin, just like the
Yeah.
sin of humanity. But I think like having that idea or that belief kind of led me to feel like that I was like resisting what was going on in my body because I was like, this isn't the way it should be, and I need it to not be this way, and that kind of prevented me from accepting the situation I was in, and I think the journey of learning to accept that like my body was going through this process and it wasn't necessarily a bad process, like just to kind of accept what is. That led me back to the creation story. So what really helped me was just in the creation story, God says uh, everything is good,
Yeah.
but good doesn't mean perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
And good means like it's beautiful, it's worthy, it has a purpose. And what I kind of realized through like thinking about that more is that like the purpose of my body is not to like function at this like high level, however that's defined
Mm.
at this normal level by society. And it's often very cultural.
Yeah.
That has to do with, the advertising and these narratives that we have that are very human made.
Yeah.
But the purpose of my body is to relate to others and to connect me to other people and to God and to creation. And so I was still able to live purposefully in my body, even though it was suffering and things weren't going as I wanted them to. So that was one of the big kind of shifts for me as I thought about healing. And also just questioning, again, as I already kind of mentioned, what is really normal.
Mm-hmm.
Realizing that a lot of those things that we think of as beautiful or normal often come from um, just cultural expectations,
Yeah.
and that there's really a range of different abilities and different levels of functioning that we have throughout, being a human. And we often think the default is being able-bodied and healthy, but we can see, like, through people with disabilities and in the aging process, that we're all on the spectrum, and we're kind of going in and out of different levels of ability and health, and that's part of being human. It's not something that we need to, like, prevent.
Right.
And we're not doing something wrong if, and or like something's not off about our spiritual lives and our connection with God if we are in a spot of pain and suffering.
Yes, that
Those are
is.
the big things that I took away from that period.
Yeah, I love that so much because that's so important, and I'm so glad you shared that, because so many, depending on their background or what they've heard and seen, can believe that because they're hurting, it's because, they've done something wrong or that God doesn't care about them or they don't have or don't have enough faith, and it's not the
Mhm.
case. So I love how you bring that out so beautifully in your words now and in your book as well. I love this idea of, well, one, I love that your husband is I'm a fellow engineer. And so you have a part
Oh,
in your book that talks about questions, it's practical questions
mhm.
actually that's concerning medical help. And I wanted to share this with the our listeners because I feel like sometimes we get into these time frames and seasons where we don't have anything practical to do. Tell us a little bit, and I'll share these questions, and then,
Mhm.
maybe you can just tell us a little bit of, like, like, how these questions came about, like,
Okay.
maybe the story of surrounding these questions. So, um,
Mhm.
your husband is an engineer, and he has these questions when it comes to deciding on medical assistance or going to the doctor, and it says you consider, like, what is the cost, what are the chances it will work, how much will our life improve if it works, would undergoing treatment bring more stress than the problem itself, are there any other ways we want to use the money, and then what if we do nothing. So these are questions, and they're hard when we're
Mhm.
desperate for relief, but I love that you include these practical things as well, because, we as Christ followers, we believe and we pray, but what are some practical things that we can do as we're walking this thing out day by day? And so,
Mhm.
can you just kind of talk about how those questions came about?
Yeah, sure. Well, when I was first in pain, my biggest priority was just to not be in pain.
Yeah,
And so I was really desperate to do everything I could at whatever expense to go back to normal.
yeah,
And that led me to doing a lot of treatments out of desperation and fear of what might happen if I didn't keep working on the problem. And I think a lot of it had to do with this kind of perception that we have that kind of medicine can fix
yeah,
everything, and we just need to find the right thing. And my husband, he's very practical, and he, as an engineer, he's always trained to, like, consider all the options and even the option of doing nothing as a possibility. So even though I was kind of frustrated when he was like, "Wait, is that really that kind of out there treatment? Like, what chances of it are there that it's going to actually work?" And then if even if it does work, how much improvement would you really see, and what is the cost? Like, is it really worth the stress of going through this thing? I had this one treatment where they were injecting like a sugar solution into my ankle, which to like inflame it again and try to like restart the healing process. But it involved like the guy injecting like tons of,
Oh,
there's like tons of pokes
yeah.
into my ankle. Like, I would say like 20 or 30, injections. So, and it didn't do much, but at the time I was like, I don't care. I'll just try anything.
Yeah.
So I think when we have this sense that medicine will fix it, we just need to throw as much money at it as we can.
Mhm.
Um, and then realizing, and it's also a very American
Yeah.
thing too, right? That
True.
that we'll get if we just have enough money and resources, we can fix the problem. And
Yeah.
to realize that that wasn't the case was really hard because it meant that I really had no control over it, and I just had to sit with the feeling of being not in control and waiting, which is a really hard thing,
Yeah.
especially in our American culture, because so many things are so easy. Like we expect our internet to just come
Yes.
up, and we don't want to wait even 5 seconds for something to load because it's just way too long.
So true.
We have so many expectations of how long things will take and how easy things will be for us that really got challenged by this process.
Yeah. I almost feel like just in hearing the story behind it is if questions like these help us to slow down.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're so quick to jump to fixing, and some of this, the deepest spiritual transformation
Mm.
comes when we don't jump right away to the solution, but we stay in that space where we are really reckoning with our humanity and our vulnerability, and seeing that as like that is the human condition, like not this other illusion where we're just all together and put together and we got it all under control. That's not like the real humanity. And I think that that's one of the things that in my book I really wanted to stress is that spot where we're slowing down and we're just like looking at like who we really are as human beings in the face, that we are vulnerable to all this loss, and it can come at any moment, and it's really scary because you just feel like, wow, all these things I did in all my life to prevent these things from happening did not prevent them from happening.
Yeah.
So it can really shake your sense of self. But I think to realize that those places are actually the places where we see God and where we experience um, connection with others, like the kind of like dependency on other people in community that God designed us for, and that we wouldn't be able to if we were constantly on the move and fixing our problems and just moving about with our plan for our life. Like those interruptions are actually the places where God meets us and just shows us who he is and who we are.
Mm. That's so powerful and it's so needed. And I love this conversation because we don't hear enough of this, because we do see um, loss and grief and pain and suffering as interruptions to our life. Like, if this wouldn't have happened, then I would be, happy and joy, just life would be grand and great. And,
Mm.
um, but if we read our Bible, and we really study the scriptures, that's not what this life is about because of all the way back in Genesis, the fall, and sin.
Mhm.
And that's one thing that I mentioned in my book as well. And if
Mm.
it seems so simple to say sin is the problem, and some people will look at that because they're hurting so bad and say, oh, that doesn't really help me,
Mhm.
so it's challenging to bring these conversations about and to just kind of help people become more aware of um, this is where we find who God is. This is where we reestablish
Mhm.
who his character, what his character is like, and really truly see God. And like you're saying, being vulnerable and seeing our true humanity and knowing that we're not in control
Mm-hmm.
of our lives. So I want to read this that you talk about shalom, and
Mm-hmm.
when I hear that word, the first thing I think of is peace. You
Mm-hmm.
think of, but you kind of unpacked it, as you were saying, it was the closest word found in the Bible to mean health
Mm-hmm.
and wholeness, completeness, well-being. And then this quote from John Swinton, a disciple scholar, which says, "Shalom is not the absence of illness, disease, or disability. It has to do with the presence of God. Healing always has first and foremost to do with connecting and reconnecting people to God." So, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. The idea of health, right, as again, as like being absent of disease, as being some like medically defined standard of uh, functionality, um, that can kind of put people on this track where that's what they're seeking is just to be rid of the problem. And so I really appreciated finding John Swinton's definition of health
Yeah.
as more of the presence of God. And I would also say like the presence of other people
Mhm.
and being connected in community as this more holistic definition of health that isn't so much about just me
Yeah.
and what I'm feeling or not feeling in my body, but more about um, like how my wellness is connected to my community and also to the planet, I would say too, because
Mhm.
I think what we're seeing all over the world is that, you know, all these natural disasters are affecting us and the things that we put in the air and the water affect us. And so if we're not thinking about health in all these layers, not just the individual's experience, but also the individual within a community and the individual within their ecosystem, within this like society that functions well, then we're not really addressing it in a way that will lead to lasting well-being. We're only addressing it in this little,
Right.
little tiny portion. If we're only thinking about one person's health as what we're solving.
Hmm. I love that as well. And it kind of moves us into, you have a portion, and maybe you can give us some um, ways that you've done this, and then ways that possibly those who are listening can do this. But embracing our limits
Mm-hmm.
and embracing our invincibility and our vulnerability as being
Mm-hmm.
key to becoming whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was another big struggle was to realize that the fact that I couldn't walk,
Yeah,
it was like so limiting. And uh, like to me, it was a bad thing because it was like the things that I couldn't do. And I was so focused on that. Um, but I was just realizing that that is just again part of who we are as human beings. Like we live in bodies, we have bodies, and that means that we're not going to be able to be everywhere at once, and we can only live within a certain temperature because that's what our bodies were designed
yeah,
for. We can't never sleep, we can't like constantly be doing things all the time. We need rest, we need time to do nothing.
yeah,
And that's all really hard as someone who has been socialized to feel like overcoming our limits is the good thing.
yeah,
And even within, you know, the church community, that can also be kind of an expectation that, oh, you might have this or that ailment, but the goal is to keep doing what you're doing. And that's how God kind of like shows up for you is that despite this
yeah,
thing, I can still do this. And it does set up this culture where we're constantly trying to do more than we can, and pushing our limits. And it's really hard to go in the opposite direction. It's really countercultural to say instead we're going to embrace our limits, because that's what makes us human,
Right.
and then that's what allows us to again receive help from other people, to understand God as being sufficient for us even when we aren't sufficient, and to be able to just be fully human,
Yeah.
as being limited human beings. So yeah, the practical ways that I've done that, I think in this whole journey of chronic illness, is realizing that I can't push my body more than my body wants to go, and I have to stop, and I have to really build in times of rest,
Mm.
um, and to recognize the signals that my body's giving me. I think I'm getting better at that than I used to be. Whether that's like a headache or something's hurting more than it normally hurts, or even just like the feeling of just like listening to, like, if my body's, or if just like internally I'm saying I don't want to do that thing, like
Oh,
somebody's asking me to do something, I
yeah.
often want to say yes because it's just so, like, as a people pleaser, it's so
Right.
easy as
Yeah.
women, it's like just how we're socialized, and to say no is really hard, but like
Mhm.
learning to say no more has been
Yeah.
really helpful for me. And those are all ways that I'm just honoring, like, this is, maybe it's a season, or maybe that's just like that's how my body is, or how I'm recognizing that that's just my capacity, and it's not beyond that. Those have all been really healthy and healing ways for me to, just honor who I am.
Mhm. And I wanted to kind of touch on, because you mentioned community a few times, and
Mhm.
um, just talk about how community again can add to the type of healing or wholeness that we can
Mhm.
experience um, as we're walking through, um, like a pain or suffering or a chronic illness. What
Mhm.
role does community play?
I was thinking about this story today, when I was having, um, some of my worst pain, like a
Mm.
couple of years into this chronic pain, because I started in my ankle, but then as I was walking differently, it also
Yeah.
kind of went up my whole spine. So my back was hurting, and we were moving. But I wasn't really able to clean the apartment up because I was in so much pain. So some friends came over and they helped us to clean the house, and it was really hard for me to sit on the side and watch them do the work, because I am a doer and I like to get things done. So that was just one example of the
Yeah.
ways that, being being able to recognize my limits and to be honest about where I was and communicating that to other people allowed them to step in and be community for me, and opened up this space of vulnerability and connection and interdependence.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that I, have tried to name too in the book and in my journey, is that even though we don't, as we're going through hard times and things that, may be limiting, that doesn't mean we don't have gifts to offer to
Mm.
other people. Like,
Good.
we have gifts to offer and they have gifts to offer us. And a lot of times we tend to see, people who are kind of in a place of suffering as people that we minister to, and they have nothing to offer, and we're just there to help them and maybe fix their problem and get them past this.
Yeah.
But that there are a lot of gifts that people who are suffering have to offer, or people who are experiencing pain or limits, have to offer.
Mhm.
And those might be, just slowing down, as you mentioned, like causing other people to slow down too, and ask like the big questions that we all have in life. or just experiencing time differently, because we kind of have been pushed off the rat race,
Yeah.
whether we like it or not. Um, or just recognizing, naming that that vulnerability is like really part of our human condition. So those are all gifts that we can offer. So I think when we are able to lean into those hard, uncomfortable spaces, we're able to experience a deeper kind of giving and taking, and that sense of community that we were made for.
Mhm. I love you mentioning that because I've actually experienced that in the past, like several times, and even heard of other people experience it when they go to quote unquote minister to someone, even someone who's terminally
Mm-hmm.
ill. They walked
Mm-hmm.
me and said, "You know, I went to minister to them, but I left with so much more. They ended up ministering to me." And it's so
Mm-hmm.
crazy because I never thought about, yeah, those, I never looked at it that way. Like they still have
Mm-hmm.
gifts to offer. What and
Yeah.
it's that is powerful. That is so
Yeah, we need those people who are. One of the books that I read um, uh, named it as like, this is a doctor who worked with like terminally ill cancer patients, and she talked about these people as being kind of on the margins of life, and maybe they're on the margins of our church, and
mm,
they're the people that go up in the aisles to get prayed for, and
mhm.
we see them kind of as like not really central to the life of the community, but they are really
Yeah.
central, because they kind of break open within
Mm,
us that space where we can be more receptive to others and to God, and to experience time differently. So yeah, like you said, those are really powerful moments
mhm.
when we can enter those spaces with people who are
Yeah.
suffering.
Gosh, that is so beautiful. I want to read this quote from your book. It says, "Our suffering has the power to bring us into the innermost holy of holies with Jesus, where we join it where we join in to His hand, and it takes on new meaning." And then you say, "What is most comforting to me as I read the Gospels is not that Jesus explains the meaning of our suffering, or that my pain makes sense in God's cosmic economy. It's that Jesus knows my suffering intimately and is here with me." And that is just so powerful as well. So let's kind of end or kind of talk through this as we kind of close how Jesus knows our suffering.
I think the question I really wanted answered at the beginning was the why
Yeah.
question. Like, why am I going through this? Um, and then, a lot of different people around me, and friends and prayer partners and ministers, helped me to see that like the more important questions are like the who and the how.
Mm,
So like, who is God to me, and that again is where and who am I going to become as a result of this
yeah.
thing that I'm going through, and that's where it's so powerful to know that our God isn't one that is separate and stayed at some disconnected level while we're here in in our bodies on the earth going through all of this mess. Another quote that I really love is from Corrie ten Boom, who
Mhm.
helped like Jewish people in the
Yeah.
Holocaust, and I think this is from her sister, and they were like in a concentration camp at the time, and she said that there's no pit that's so deep that God's love is not deeper still. So that, I think, is the most powerful message of the gospel, is that God is with us in our
Mhm.
suffering, even if we might not know why it's
Yeah.
happening. But like, who is God to me? God is the one who is nearer to me than my breath, and that this is the rock that I'm standing on, is God's presence and God's love, not this idea that I'm going to get better, or that I have to do these things and then I'll get better.
Right.
It, it's just that he's here now and that I can experience that connection with God now. And then the other question that has been helpful, besides asking why all the time, is also asking how, like how am I going to live now? How am I going to treat people? Yeah, how is God going to show up for
Yeah.
me in this moment?
That's so good. Yep. So I want, if you could, what encouragement would you leave, or can you leave for those who are listening that they're walking through this season? And I say season, but it could it can be what life is right now for them. They don't know, they don't see an ending to it, you know. They are
Mm-hmm.
walking through chronic pain, illness, um, just suffering. What kind of
Mm-hmm.
encouragement could you leave with them? Those who feel hopeless and have a different idea of healing, like I just want this to be gone.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think the thing that made me most depressed when I was in the middle of that, like not just the pain, the physical pain, but the emotional pain that came with it, of just like really resisting, like this is not what my life is meant to be. I just got to get over this, and then I'll be back to my normal life. Um, it's like feeling like this was going to be the way it was forever. Like I think I do that a lot. I don't know if other people do, but you kind of
Yeah.
like feel like you're in this bad situation, and you can't imagine how it's going to be any different, especially if the outward circumstances look like they're going to stay the same. And so you can't even imagine, like, how am I ever going to not feel like I don't want to get out of bed in the morning and have any different emotions towards life. And I think as I just kind of kept putting one foot in front of the other and waking up in the morning and just like taking a deep breath and saying, okay, God, I'm going to just like live just this day
Yeah.
and I'll get to the next day, is that it does change. Like even if the outward situation doesn't change, like things change internally, and you find spiritual resources and like just like the will to live and the ability to keep going, that I think does come from God, the giver of life, that allows you to see things in a new perspective. And it might take time, and you might feel like this is just this long tunnel that goes on forever, but things start to look different after a while. I know that like my pain didn't get better right away. Eventually it did, but even before it did, I was just able to adjust. And I think that's just like a God-given gift, that we adjust to our new reality and we start to find things that are meaningful and funny and exciting to do. And yeah, we find life-giving things like in the moment that we're in. So that is really helpful to me to realize, like, this is not going to stay the same,
Yeah.
even if it's really hard right now and I feel like I just can't bear it. It's not going to be this way tomorrow. It's not going to be this way the next day. Like every day is a little different.
Yeah. That's so beautiful. And I had one more thing that I wanted to ask as you were talking. Oh, how are you doing these days? Like, what
Mm-hmm.
is life like in the present for you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. I had about 3 or 4 years where I like wasn't able to walk very much and was just super depressed and anxious and all of those things that come along with that kind of a health change. But I did eventually get better, and I can't really explain it. Like there was some therapies that helped. I also got pregnant, so I think a lot of things changed in my
Mm.
body. But I can't really explain it, but I am able to walk now, and I'm so grateful. Sometimes I'm just taking a hike and I'm like, wow, I can walk, and I wasn't able to, and it was like the thing I wanted the most in life, just to be able to take a walk. So
Yeah.
I'm so grateful to be able to have most of my mobility back, and I still have, you know, different like ongoing pain issues that come from that season where things aren't fully better, and I'm not expecting to go back to that normal that I I was in before. And I think I have a lot more resources now and a lot more kind of wisdom about how to confront those situations where I'm suddenly in an acute episode of pain. Again, realizing, oh, this is not going to be this way forever. I have like so much help and support from people. I have all these different remedies that I know have sort of helped me in the past that I can kind of go to and lean on. So all of that has really helped, and I'm just constantly in, kind of in an evolving relationship with God, realizing that I have perceptions about who God is and how God works, and lots of things in my life are going to come up against that and show me new aspects of who God is. And I think just being open to that and being willing to continually dialogue with God and allow our perspectives to change and not get stuck in like, well, this is who I thought God was. So if he's not acting that way, then I don't know what to do. But just to like be in constant communication and openness has been really helpful to me.
Oh, I love that. I love your story. I'm so glad that you're doing well. I'm thankful for the wisdom that you gleaned and gained through just that time and season that you were in, just to be able to help others, to help me, to help others who are experiencing, times of suffering. And I so enjoyed this conversation with you. And thanks so much for sitting with me, Liuan.
Thank you, Natasha. It was a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this conversation with Liuan Huska on sitting with chronic pain and illness. Find helpful resources from this episode in the description, including my book, Can You Just Sit With Me? Healthy Grieving for the Losses of Life, and Liuan's book, Hurting Yet Whole, Reconciling Body and Spirit in Chronic Pain and Illness. Be sure to share, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you stream. Thanks again for sitting with me.